You dream of connection, the outback beckons. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing at the edge of something truly vast, not the familiar vastness of your inbox or the endless scroll of obligations, but something that puts the weight you carry into perspective. Picture, if you will, the Australian continent in 1860. A landmass so immense that you could lose entire European nations within its red heart and never find them again. The sun is setting over what the locals call the Never Never, that endless expanse of desert, scrubland, and mystery that stretches from the settled coastal fringes into an interior so forbidding, so unknown that even the indigenous peoples who have walked its paths for 40,000 years speak of it with reverence and caution. The light here doesn't simply fade, it transforms. The harsh white glare of midday melts into amber, then copper, then the deepest crimson you've ever seen, painting the spinifex grass and scattered ghost gums in shades that exist nowhere else on Earth. In this moment, as you stand on the threshold between the known and unknown, you're witnessing something remarkable. The last great blank space on the map of human ambition. While you've been building your empire of ideas and innovation, wrestling with the challenges of our connected world, there was once a time when connection itself seemed impossible, when the very notion of instant communication across continents was as fantastical as the dreams that keep you awake at 3 in the morning. But here's what I find fascinating about this moment in 1860. In the comfortable drawing rooms of Adelaide and Melbourne, in the government offices where men in wool suits sweated through the Antipodean summer, someone was dreaming an impossible dream. Not the comfortable incremental dreams of quarterly growth or market expansion, but the kind of audacious vision that would make even your boldest plans seem modest by comparison. His name was Charles Todd, and he carried a weight not unlike yours. Postmaster General of South Australia, a title that sounds quaint now, but carried enormous responsibility then. Every letter, every crucial communication, every lifeline between the isolated colonies and the wider world, it all flowed through his hands. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, what isolation truly meant. Not the isolation of a difficult day or a challenging quarter, but the crushing isolation of being literally months away from the rest of human civilization. Picture Todd in his office as the evening light fades over Adelaide. Maps spread across his desk, correspondence piled high, the weight of connection, or rather, the lack of it, pressing down on him like the humid summer air. Letters from London took 4 months to arrive, if they arrived at all. News of wars, of markets, of the deaths of loved ones. All of it filtered through that impossible distance like whispers across an ocean. But Todd had heard something extraordinary. Across the Atlantic, they said, men had done the impossible. They had laid a cable along the ocean floor, a thread of copper and determination stretching from Ireland to Newfoundland. For a brief, shining moment in 1858, Queen Victoria had sent a message to President Buchanan, and the words had traveled not in months, but in minutes. The cable had failed after just weeks of operation, but it had worked. Connection across the impossible had been achieved. Now Todd stared at his maps of Australia and dared to dream of something even more audacious. Not a cable across a familiar ocean, but a line of poles and wire stretching across the most hostile landscape on Earth. From Adelaide in the south to Darwin in the north. Nearly 2,000 miles of desert, mountains, and mystery. And from Darwin, a submarine cable to Java, connecting Australia to the global telegraph network that was slowly, methodically shrinking the world. The vision was breathtaking in its scope. A thin line of wire that would transform Australia from an isolated outpost into a connected part of the modern world. Stock prices from London would arrive in hours, not months. News of discoveries, of opportunities, of crises, all of it flowing along that fragile thread of human ingenuity. But here's what strikes me most about Todd's dream. It wasn't just about the technology. It wasn't even primarily about the engineering, though the engineering would prove to be extraordinary. It was about something deeper, something that perhaps resonates with the work you're building today. It was about the fundamental human need to be connected, to be part of something larger than ourselves, to bridge the gaps that geography and circumstance place between us. You see, Todd understood something that every leader eventually learns, that isolation isn't just a physical condition. It's a state of mind, a weight that grows heavier with each passing day. Those long nights when you're the only one awake, carrying decisions that others can't fully understand. Todd knew that feeling. He lived it every day, watching Australia drift further and further behind the connected world, watching opportunities slip away at the speed of sailing ships and horse-drawn mail. But dreams, as you well know, are only the beginning. Between vision and reality lies that vast, uncharted territory of execution, and in Todd's case, that territory was quite literally uncharted. To build his overland telegraph, he would need to know what lay in that red heart of the continent. He would need roads, or at least tracks. He would need water sources, supply points, an understanding of the land itself. This is where our story takes its first turn toward adventure. Because to map the unmappable, Todd would need explorers. Not the gentleman adventurers of popular imagination, but hard, practical men who understood that exploration wasn't about glory. It was about survival. Men who could read the landscape like you read market trends, who could find opportunity in the most unlikely places, who could push forward when every rational voice suggested turning back. The man he found was John McDouall Stuart, a name that should be better known than it is. Stuart was everything Todd needed. Experienced, determined, and possessed of that particular kind of madness that drives people to attempt the impossible. He had already made several attempts to cross the continent, each one teaching him more about the country's secrets, each failure bringing him closer to success. Stuart understood something crucial about the Australian interior. It wasn't empty. To European eyes, trained on the green landscapes of home, it might appear barren, hostile, lifeless. But Stuart had learned to read its subtle signs. The way certain trees grew indicated underground water. The flight patterns of birds revealed hidden springs. The very rocks themselves told stories of ancient seas and future possibilities. In March of 1860, as Todd refined his telegraph plans in Adelaide, Stuart was preparing for what he hoped would be his final attempt. A journey from south to north, from the edge of settlement to the tropical coast, across 2,000 miles of country that existed more in imagination than in fact. His team was small, just 2 other men, a handful of horses, and supplies for what might be months in the wilderness. But here's what I find remarkable about Stuart's preparation. He didn't approach this as a conquest. He approached it as a conversation. Years of experience had taught him that the land wasn't his enemy. It was his teacher. Every waterhole, every ridge, every seemingly barren stretch held lessons for those patient enough to learn them. The Aboriginal peoples he occasionally encountered weren't obstacles to his progress. They were libraries of knowledge, keepers of secrets that could mean the difference between life and death. As Stuart's small party rode north from Adelaide, following tracks that existed more in hope than reality, they were carrying more than just supplies and instruments. They were carrying Todd's dream, Australia's future, and the hopes of everyone who had ever felt the weight of isolation pressing down on them like the vast southern sky. The country they entered was magnificent and terrible in equal measure. Landscapes that could inspire and intimidate in the same moment. Red sand stretching to horizons that shimmered with heat. Rocky outcrops that rose like ancient monuments to forgotten gods. Dry creek beds that spoke of water that might come tomorrow or might not come for years. And in the evenings, as Stuart's small party made camp under stars that seemed close enough to touch, they were writing the first chapters of a story that would transform a continent. Not through conquest or domination, but through understanding. Through the patient, methodical work of learning what the land had to teach and finding ways to work with it rather than against it. This is where our journey truly begins. With 3 men, a handful of horses, and a dream of connection riding north into the unknown. Behind them, the comfortable settlements of the south. Ahead, 2,000 miles of mystery, challenge, and possibility. And threading through it all, the invisible line of Todd's telegraph, waiting to be born from vision into reality, waiting to shrink the vast distances that had defined Australia since the first European eyes gazed upon its shores. The adventure that follows will test everything they thought they knew about leadership, about persistence, about the delicate balance between ambition and wisdom. Lessons that echo still in the challenges you face, in the weight you carry, in the vision you're building one difficult decision at a time. Mapping the impossible, Stuart's journey and the surveyor's task. But first, someone had to prove it could be done. Someone had to walk into that emptiness and return with more than stories. With maps, with measurements, with the kind of hard-won knowledge that transforms impossible dreams into engineering blueprints. John McDouall Stuart understood this weight, the weight of being first, of carrying not just his own life into the unknown, but the hopes of an entire continent balanced on his shoulders. When he set out from Adelaide in October 1861, leading his small party north into the heart of Australia, he carried with him more than supplies and surveying instruments. He carried the future itself. Picture Stuart in those early morning hours before departure, the same hours when you might find yourself awake, mind turning over the magnitude of what you're attempting to build. The same quiet reckoning with the gap between vision and reality. Stuart knew, as you know, that someone has to take the first step into uncertainty. Someone has to be willing to map the impossible. The expedition that followed would test every assumption about what human determination could achieve. For months, Stuart's party pushed north through landscape that seemed designed to break the spirit. Waterless stretches that lasted for days, scrubland that tore at clothes and skin, heat that turned metal too hot to touch and made every decision feel like a gamble with survival itself. But Stuart possessed something that all great pathfinders share: the patience to work with the land rather than against it. When the direct route proved impossible, he found another way. When water sources failed, he learned to read the subtle signs that spoke of hidden springs. When his horses collapsed from exhaustion, he rested, regrouped, and continued with what remained. This is the kind of leadership that builds lasting things, not the dramatic charge over the hill, but the quiet persistence that finds a way through when no way seems to exist. The willingness to adapt without abandoning the larger purpose. The understanding that every great achievement is really a series of smaller victories, each one earned through the patient accumulation of knowledge and the refusal to let setbacks define the outcome. On July 24, 1862, after months of struggle, Stuart's party reached the northern coast of Australia. They had done it. They had proved that a route existed across the continent's heart. More importantly, they had mapped it. Every water source, every challenging passage, every stretch where the future telegraph line would need to thread its way through seemingly impossible terrain. When Stuart returned to Adelaide, thin and weathered but triumphant, he carried with him something more valuable than gold. He carried proof that the impossible was simply the difficult waiting for someone patient enough to understand it. But knowing a route exists and building across it are entirely different challenges. Todd now faced the surveyor's task, the methodical work of turning Stuart's heroic journey into something measurable, manageable, buildable. This is where vision meets the grinding reality of implementation, where the romance of exploration gives way to the harder romance of construction. The man Todd chose to lead this crucial phase was James Patterson, a surveyor whose reputation had been built on the kind of precise, unglamorous work that makes grand visions possible. Patterson understood that the telegraph line's success would depend not on dramatic gestures, but on thousands of small decisions made correctly. The exact placement of poles, the careful calculation of spans across rivers, the patient mapping of supply routes that would keep construction crews alive in the desert. Patterson's first task was to establish base camps along Stuart's route, staging points where men and materials could be gathered before pushing deeper into the interior. Each camp had to be positioned with mathematical precision. Too far apart, and supply lines would snap under the strain. Too close together, and the project would drain its resources before reaching the halfway point. This is the kind of thinking that separates successful builders from dreamers. The ability to break an impossible challenge into manageable pieces without losing sight of how those pieces fit together. Patterson spent weeks walking the same ground Stuart had covered, but with different eyes. Where Stuart saw obstacles to overcome, Patterson saw problems to solve systematically. The surveying work began in earnest in early 1863. Teams spread out along the proposed route, each responsible for mapping a specific section in exhaustive detail. They measured elevations, tested soil conditions, located water sources, and calculated the logistics of getting materials to each construction point. It was painstaking work, made more challenging by the Australian climate's relentless extremes. Summer temperatures that could kill a man in hours. winter nights that dropped below freezing, sudden storms that turned dry creek beds into raging torrents, washing away weeks of careful measurement. But Patterson's teams possessed something that all great builders eventually develop: the ability to find satisfaction in incremental progress. Each day's work added another small piece to the larger puzzle. Each accurate measurement brought the impossible slightly closer to possible. The early surveys revealed just how audacious Todd's vision truly was. The line would need to cross more than 1,800 miles of some of the world's most challenging terrain. Deserts where water was scarce and temperatures extreme, mountain ranges that would require careful engineering to navigate, rivers that could be bone-dry one week and impassable torrents the next. The logistics alone were staggering. Thousands of telegraph poles would need to be transported across roadless wilderness. Miles of wire would have to be strung in conditions that ranged from brutal heat to freezing cold. Construction crews would need food, water, and shelter in places where none existed naturally. Yet as Patterson's surveys progressed, something remarkable began to emerge: a detailed understanding of how the impossible might actually be achieved, not through force or haste, but through the patient application of knowledge and the willingness to adapt methods to conditions rather than expecting conditions to yield to methods. This is perhaps the most crucial lesson that Patterson's work offers to anyone carrying the weight of building something significant: the understanding that thorough preparation is not the enemy of bold action, but its essential foundation. The surveys that seemed to slow progress were actually accelerating it, creating the knowledge base that would allow construction to proceed efficiently when the time came. Patterson divided the route into manageable sections, each with its own challenges and requirements. The southern section, running from Adelaide into the heart of the continent, would be relatively straightforward. Existing settlements could provide supply bases, and the terrain, while challenging, was familiar. The central section would test everything they thought they knew about desert construction. Here, the line would cross the most desolate parts of the continent, where water was scarce and the nearest settlement might be hundreds of miles away. This section would require the most careful planning, the most precise logistics, and the most resilient construction methods. The northern section presented different challenges: tropical conditions, seasonal flooding, and terrain that shifted from desert to swampland depending on the time of year. Here, the challenge would be adapting construction methods to conditions unlike anything the builders had encountered before. Each section required its own approach, its own timeline, its own careful calculation of resources and risks. This is the kind of systematic thinking that transforms overwhelming challenges into manageable projects: the ability to see the whole while working methodically on the parts. As 1863 progressed, Patterson's surveys began to reveal something else. The profound isolation that made the telegraph line so necessary also made its construction extraordinarily difficult. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of empty country. Communication between survey teams could take weeks. Every decision had to be made with incomplete information and the understanding that mistakes could be deadly. Yet the work continued, driven by the same patient determination that had carried Stuart across the continent. Each day brought new challenges, but also new solutions. Each problem solved added to the growing body of knowledge that would make construction possible. The weight Patterson carried was different from Stuart's, but no less significant. Where Stuart had carried the burden of proving the impossible was possible, Patterson carried the burden of making the possible practical. Both forms of leadership were essential. Both required the willingness to persist when progress seemed impossibly slow. By the end of 1863, Patterson's teams had completed their initial surveys of the entire route. The impossible had been measured, mapped, and broken down into manageable challenges. The dream of connecting Australia to the world was ready to become a construction project. But as Todd reviewed Patterson's reports in his Adelaide office, he understood that the hardest work still lay ahead. Surveying the route was one thing. Actually building across it would test everything they had learned about leadership, logistics, and the patient art of turning vision into reality. The adventure was about to enter its most demanding phase, the phase where careful planning meets the unforgiving reality of construction in one of the world's most challenging environments. Supplies and sustenance, a line across the desert. The supply trains began forming at dawn, long before the Adelaide heat could make the work unbearable. Picture, if you will, the sight that greeted Todd each morning as he walked to the Telegraph depot. Strings of camels being loaded with everything needed to sustain human life in the vast emptiness ahead. Each camel could carry perhaps 300 pounds. Water barrels, flour sacks, dried meat, tools, wire, insulators, the countless small necessities that keep civilization functioning when you're building it from scratch. The Afghan camel drivers, brought from their own harsh landscapes, understood something the Europeans were still learning, that in the desert, every ounce matters. You know this feeling, don't you? That careful calculation of resources, weighing what's essential against what's merely useful. In your world, it might be cash flow and runway. Here, it was literally survival, measured in pounds of flour and gallons of water. The supply master, a methodical Scotsman named Mackenzie, kept ledgers that would have impressed any modern logistics manager. Every item catalogued, every delivery scheduled, every consumption rate calculated. He understood that romance and adventure meant nothing if the work crews ran out of food 300 miles from the nearest settlement. The desert doesn't forgive optimism, he would say, checking his calculations for the third time each morning. It only respects preparation. The camel trains moved like slow rivers across the landscape, sometimes 20 animals in a line, sometimes 50, depending on the distance to the work camps. From Adelaide, they carried fresh supplies northward. From the work sites, they brought back reports, broken equipment, and occasionally men who couldn't endure the isolation any longer. The rhythm of these supply runs became the heartbeat of the entire project. Every 3 days, a train would depart. Every week, one would return. The timing had to be precise. Too frequent, and the cost would bankrupt the project. Too infrequent, and work would stop as crews waited for essential materials. Todd often rode with these supply trains in the early months, learning firsthand what his men faced in the field. The experience taught him something crucial about leadership, that understanding the daily reality of those who execute your vision is not optional. It's the foundation of everything else. The first supply run he joined stretched for 6 days across terrain that seemed designed to test human resolve. The sun rose like a furnace each morning, turning the red earth into a shimmering oven by noon. The camels, patient and sure-footed, seemed unbothered by conditions that left the men seeking any scrap of shade. Water was the constant concern. Not just drinking water, but water for cooking, for washing, for the thousand small needs that emerge when you're trying to maintain health and morale in conditions that strip away every comfort. Each gallon had to be carried, protected, rationed with the care of a precious medicine. The work crews they supplied were scattered across hundreds of miles. Small teams of 6 or 8 men, each responsible for a section of line. These weren't grand construction gangs, but intimate groups who became like family out of necessity. They shared everything. Food, shelter, the peculiar bond that forms when survival depends on absolute reliability. At each camp, Todd observed the same careful rituals. The evening meal prepared with ingredients that had traveled hundreds of miles. Tools cleaned and organized despite the dust that penetrated everything. Letters written by lamplight to families who seemed impossibly distant. These men weren't heroes in any dramatic sense. They were craftsmen doing difficult work under extraordinary conditions. They measured their days in poles erected, wires strung, small victories accumulated one at a time. The kind of patient progress that builds everything worthwhile, including what you're building now. The camp routine was precise because it had to be. Dawn brought tea and damper bread, made from flour that arrived by camel train. The work began early, before the heat became dangerous. Midday meant rest in whatever shade could be found, often just a canvas stretched between poles, creating a pocket of relief in the vast exposure. Evenings were for maintenance, not just of equipment, but of the human connections that kept the work possible. Stories shared, problems solved collectively. The quiet satisfaction of another day's progress marked and recorded. The supply trains brought more than material goods. They carried news, mail, the psychological sustenance of knowing you weren't forgotten in the emptiness. Mackenzie understood this, often including small luxuries that weren't strictly necessary. A tin of jam, tobacco, newspapers from Adelaide that arrived weeks old but were read like treasure. Water remained the defining challenge. Each work camp needed a reliable source, but in much of the interior, water meant digging wells or hauling every drop from distant sources. The Aboriginal guides proved invaluable here. Their knowledge of seasonal water sources, of reading the land for signs invisible to European eyes, became essential to the project's survival. Todd learned to read the supply reports like a physician reading symptoms. Delayed deliveries meant problems, equipment breakdowns, difficult weather, sometimes conflicts with local tribes who saw the telegraph line as an unwelcome intrusion across traditional lands. Each supply train carried weapons, but Todd insisted they be used only for protection, never aggression. He understood something that many colonial projects ignored, that success in this landscape required cooperation, not conquest. The Aboriginal peoples knew things about survival here that no European manual could teach. The camel drivers, too, became crucial partners rather than mere employees. Their knowledge of desert travel, of reading weather patterns, of managing animals in extreme conditions, proved as valuable as any engineering expertise. The project succeeded because it learned to draw on every available source of wisdom. Food spoilage was a constant concern. Meat had to be dried or salted. Flour required careful protection from moisture and insects. Fresh vegetables were rare luxuries, leading to health problems that the supply system had to address with careful nutrition planning. Scurvy became a real threat until Mackenzie began including preserved foods rich in the vitamins the men needed. The economics of supply were brutal. Every pound of material cost perhaps 10 times what it would in Adelaide, once transportation was factored in. This forced constant decisions about what was truly essential, the kind of resource allocation choices you know well from your own building process. But within these constraints, something remarkable emerged. The supply system became more than logistics. It became the nervous system of a distributed organization, carrying information and coordination across vast distances. Supply masters at each depot became local decision-makers, adapting to conditions that headquarters couldn't anticipate. Todd encouraged this distributed leadership, understanding that rigid central control would collapse under the weight of distance and communication delays. Trust had to flow both ways, headquarters trusting field decisions, field teams trusting that support would arrive as promised. The camel trains themselves became symbols of reliability in an unreliable environment. Their steady progress across the landscape, their patient endurance of conditions that defeated horses and oxen, embodied the persistence that the entire project required. As months passed, the supply system evolved into something approaching elegance. Routes were optimized, depot locations were refined. The rhythm of delivery and consumption found its natural balance. What had begun as desperate improvisation became systematic capability. This transformation, from chaotic urgency to reliable process, mirrors something you've likely experienced in your own work. The gradual emergence of systems that can handle complexity without constant crisis management. The patient building of capabilities that make the impossible merely difficult. The men in the field began to trust the system, knowing that food would arrive, that broken tools would be replaced, that their isolation was supported by an invisible network of planning and care. This trust freed them to focus on the immediate work, stringing wire, erecting poles, pushing the line steadily across the continent. By the end of the first year, the supply trains had covered thousands of miles, delivered tons of materials, and proven that systematic preparation could overcome even the most challenging logistics. The project was succeeding not through heroic gestures, but through the accumulated reliability of countless small deliveries, each one a promise kept in the vast Australian silence. Todd, reviewing the supply records in his Adelaide office, saw something profound in those careful columns of numbers. Each entry represented human effort sustained across impossible distances, the patient work of building civilization one camel load at a time. The foundation was now in place. Not just the physical infrastructure of supply lines and depot stations, but the human systems of trust and reliability that would carry the project through its greatest challenges still ahead. The unsung heroes, cooks, blacksmiths, and the heart of the camp. But beneath these grand logistics, another story was unfolding, one that rarely appears in the official dispatches or engineering reports. In the pre-dawn darkness of construction camps, scattered across 2,000 miles of wilderness, other hands were already at work. William McCarthy struck flint to tinder in the cook tent at Barrow Creek, nursing the first flames that would feed 60 men before sunrise. The weight he carried wasn't measured in miles of wire or tons of iron posts, but in the simple, essential task of keeping human bodies and spirits sustained in a land that offered neither mercy nor comfort. You know this responsibility, don't you? The understanding that everything else depends on getting the fundamentals right. That behind every ambitious vision, someone must tend to the daily needs that make the vision possible. McCarthy had followed gold rushes across 3 colonies before joining Todd's telegraph line. He'd learned that hungry men make poor decisions, that a hot meal at the end of a brutal day could mean the difference between a crew that worked together and one that fell apart. In the Australian interior, where the nearest supply depot might be 200 miles away, cooking became an act of careful mathematics. Each morning, he calculated rations with the precision of an engineer. Flour, salt beef, tea, stretching supplies that had to last until the next camel train arrived. But McCarthy understood something the ledgers couldn't capture. Men needed more than calories to survive this place. They needed the ritual of gathering around a fire, the comfort of familiar tastes in an alien landscape. The blacksmith's forge glowed like a second sun in Thomas Henderson's workshop at the Alice Springs Depot. Where McCarthy fed bodies, Henderson mended the tools that made the work possible. Every morning brought a queue of men carrying broken equipment, drill bits dulled by striking stone, wire-stringing tools snapped under tension, picks and shovels worn smooth by the relentless red earth. Henderson had learned his trade in the ironworks of Birmingham, where coal burned hot and steel arrived in neat, measured ingots. Here he worked with whatever materials the supply trains could carry, scavenging metal from broken equipment, nursing his coal supplies through the endless demands of repair and improvisation. But like McCarthy, Henderson understood that his real work went deeper than the technical. When a lineman brought in a treasured tool passed down from his father, when a surveyor's theodopod required delicate adjustment, these weren't just mechanical problems. They were about maintaining the connection between skilled hands and trusted instruments in a place where both were precious. The camp followers. That's what the official records called them, when they mentioned them at all. But Thomas Dolwood, the expedition doctor, saw them differently. The Aboriginal guides who read weather patterns in cloud formations the white men couldn't interpret. The Chinese cooks who could stretch rice and vegetables into meals that prevented scurvy. The Afghan camel drivers who understood the subtle art of keeping their animals healthy across impossible distances. Each brought knowledge that no engineering manual could provide. Knowledge earned through generations of living with this land, rather than fighting against it. Dalwood had studied medicine in Edinburgh, trained in the latest theories of disease and treatment. But his Aboriginal guide, Jackie, could predict when the dry heat would break into storms that turned creek beds into torrents. Could read the signs that meant water lay 3 feet below apparently barren ground. The weight these men carried was different from the burdens of leadership, but no less essential. They carried the accumulated wisdom of adaptation, the patient understanding of how human effort could be sustained in conditions that tested every assumption about what was possible. In the evening hours, when the day's construction work ended and the camp settled into quieter rhythms, other forms of labor began. Letters were written by lamplight, careful words that would travel back along the supply routes to wives and families in Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney. Men who could barely write their names dictated messages to those with better education, creating a network of connection that stretched across the growing line. Music emerged from concertinas and mouth harps, songs that carried the familiar melodies of home into the vast silence of the interior. These weren't grand performances, just the simple human need to create something beautiful in a harsh place, to assert that civilization meant more than just stringing wire between poles. James O'Brien, the camp carpenter, spent his evenings carving small wooden objects, combs, cups, simple toys that men could send home to children they hadn't seen in months. His hands, calloused from building telegraph poles and repair stations, found different purpose in this finer work, creating small tokens of care that could travel where the men themselves could not yet go. The Aboriginal women who sometimes visited the camps brought different gifts, knowledge of which plants could treat fever, which roots could supplement the monotonous salt beef and flour. They moved between 2 worlds, maintaining their own ancient relationships with this country while engaging with the strange enterprise of the white men's wire. Their presence reminded the construction crews of something easily forgotten in the focus on engineering challenges. This land wasn't empty wilderness waiting to be conquered. It was home to people who had developed sophisticated ways of thriving here across thousands of years. Some of the telegraph workers began to understand this, began to see their project not as imposing foreign technology on hostile terrain, but as learning to work within patterns of survival and adaptation that were far older and more tested than anything they brought from Europe. The night watches were perhaps the most important work of all, though they rarely appeared in the daily reports. Men who sat by dying fires, listening for the sounds that meant trouble, dingo packs that might threaten the camels, storms building on distant horizons, the subtle changes in wind and temperature that could signal flash floods in the morning. These watchers carried the weight of collective safety. Their vigilance allowed others to rest, to recover from the day's labor and prepare for tomorrow's challenges. In a landscape where small mistakes could have fatal consequences, the gift of undisturbed sleep became an act of profound care. William Darton, a former sailor who joined the telegraph crews at Port Augusta, found familiar rhythms in these night watches. The same patient attention he'd learned on merchant ships crossing dangerous waters, reading weather signs, listening for changes that others might miss, maintaining the quiet alertness that kept everyone safe. The camp dogs, half-wild creatures that attached themselves to the construction crews, played their own essential role in this network of care. They served as early warning systems for approaching dangers, companions for men isolated far from human society, and bridges between the European workers and the Aboriginal communities they encountered. These dogs understood what the official protocols couldn't capture. That survival in this place required alliances and adaptations that crossed the boundaries of species and culture. They moved freely between the structured world of the construction camps and the older patterns of the land itself. Dr. Dalwood noted in his journal how the men's health improved when the dogs were present, not just because of the practical benefits of their alertness and companionship, but because caring for other living creatures provided a different kind of purpose, a reminder of gentleness and responsibility that the harsh demands of construction work could sometimes erode. Todd, reading these reports in his Adelaide office, began to understand something that his engineering training hadn't prepared him for. The telegraph line's success wouldn't be measured only in technical achievements. Miles of wire strung, poles erected, messages transmitted. It would be measured in the human community that sustained those achievements. Every great endeavor, he realized, depends on this invisible infrastructure of care. The hands that prepare food, mend tools, tend to injuries, maintain morale, preserve connections to home and meaning. The patient work of keeping human beings human in conditions that test every limit. The weight these unsung heroes carried was the weight of daily devotion, showing up each morning to perform essential tasks that enabled others to focus on the dramatic challenges, creating the foundation of trust and reliability upon which all ambitious dreams ultimately rest. As winter approached the central camps, bringing blessed relief from the crushing heat but new challenges of cold nights and uncertain weather, these support networks became even more crucial. The difference between a camp that thrived and one that barely survived often came down to these fundamental questions of care and community. The telegraph line was becoming more than a communication system. It was becoming a demonstration of what human beings could accomplish when individual talents were woven together in service of something larger than any single person could achieve. The unsung heroes understood this instinctively. Their daily acts of service weren't just keeping the project alive, they were creating the very foundation upon which the future would be built. And connecting the wires, the telegraph stations and the flow of information. As the line pushed forward across those red plains, Charles Todd began to envision something that would transform the very nature of human connection. The telegraph stations themselves. These weren't merely technical waypoints on a map, they would become islands of human presence in the vast silence of the continent. Small communities where messages would flow like water through a carefully tended garden, where the invisible threads of communication would be gathered, sorted, and sent on their way across impossible distances. The weight you carry tonight, that sense of being simultaneously connected to everything and isolated from everyone. Todd understood this paradox intimately. He was designing a system that would eliminate Australia's crushing isolation, yet he knew that the very people who operated this system would themselves live in profound solitude. Each station would be positioned roughly 200 miles apart, the maximum distance a telegraph signal could travel before needing renewal. But these weren't arbitrary technical requirements. They were human settlements that would need to sustain life and purpose in some of the most remote places on Earth. Picture Alice Springs, not as the town you might know today, but as Todd first imagined it. A single building rising from red earth and spinifex grass, solar panels catching the fierce Australian sun, batteries storing power for the delicate instruments inside, a water source carefully protected and maintained, living quarters for the operators and their families. Because Todd understood something crucial about isolation, he knew that technical expertise alone wouldn't sustain these outposts. The operators would need community, purpose, a deep sense of connection to something larger than their daily routines of checking instruments and relaying messages. The men who would staff these stations, they were a particular breed, not just technically skilled, but psychologically resilient, capable of finding meaning in repetition, of maintaining precision when the nearest colleague might be 200 miles away across trackless desert. Consider William Whitten Mills, one of the first operators at Alice Springs. Each morning, he would wake to silence so complete, it seemed to have weight. No traffic, no crowds, no urgent voices calling for attention, just the vast breathing of the continent around him and the gentle clicking of the telegraph instruments. His daily rhythm became a form of meditation, checking connections, testing signal strength, receiving the streams of coded messages that flowed like digital rivers across the wire, dots and dashes that carried news from London, shipping manifests from Adelaide, personal messages between families separated by thousands of miles. Mills understood something about information that we're still learning today. He saw how news moved, how it transformed as it traveled, how the simple act of connection could reshape entire economies and relationships. Before the telegraph, news from London took months to reach Australia by ship. Stock prices, political developments, family letters, all of it arrived in great delayed waves that left Australian businesses and families making decisions based on information that was already ancient history. But now Mills could receive a message from London in the morning and relay it to Adelaide by afternoon. The world was contracting, not in size but in time. Distance was becoming irrelevant in ways that seemed almost magical. Yet Mills and his fellow operators lived this miracle in profound isolation. They were the human nodes in a vast network of connection, simultaneously at the center of global communication and utterly alone in their red desert outposts. The irony wasn't lost on them. They spent their days handling urgent messages between lovers, business partners, families, yet their own connections to human community were tenuous and precious. This is perhaps why the telegraph operators developed such extraordinary dedication to their craft. They understood viscerally what you know in your own work, that connection requires tending, that communication systems are fragile and precious, that the invisible networks binding human communities together depend on individuals willing to show up, day after day, often unnoticed and unthankful. When storms swept across the interior, when Aboriginal resistance cut the wires, when equipment failed in the brutal heat, these operators didn't simply repair technical problems. They were mending the very fabric of connection itself. Mills would ride out along the line for miles, following the wire through scrubland and over rocky outcrops, searching for breaks with the patience of a shepherd counting sheep. Because he knew that somewhere a message was waiting. A business decision hung in the balance. A family wondered about loved ones. The stations became more than their technical function. They became symbols of human persistence in the face of isolation. Proof that connection was possible even across the most forbidding landscapes. As months turned to years, something beautiful began to emerge. The operators developed their own informal network, a community of shared experience that transcended the physical distances between their stations. They began to recognize each other's sending styles, the particular rhythm and cadence with which each operator tapped out Morse code. Like handwriting or the sound of a familiar voice, these electronic signatures became deeply personal. Late at night, when official traffic was light, they would sometimes tap out conversations across the wire, sharing news about weather patterns, discussing technical challenges, simply reaching across the darkness to confirm that another human consciousness was there, listening, understanding. These quiet conversations weren't officially sanctioned, but they were essential. They transformed a network of isolated technical operators into something approaching a community. They proved that human beings will find ways to connect, to care for each other, even across vast distances and through the most impersonal technologies. The impact rippled outward in ways Todd had barely imagined. News that once took months to travel now moved in hours. Australian wool prices could respond immediately to London market conditions. Families could coordinate across continental distances. Government decisions could be implemented with unprecedented speed and coordination, but perhaps most importantly, Australia was no longer alone. The crushing psychological weight of isolation, that sense of being cut off from the rest of human civilization, began to lift. The continent was still vast, still challenging, still demanding respect and careful adaptation, but it was no longer separate. The invisible threads of communication had woven it back into the larger fabric of human community. Mills and his fellow operators had become the guardians of connection itself. Their daily acts of maintenance and care kept the messages flowing. Their dedication to precision ensured that urgent communications reached their destinations intact. They understood something profound about the nature of networks, that they're only as strong as the humans who tend them. That behind every seamless connection lies someone's patient attention to detail, someone's willingness to venture out into difficult conditions to repair what's broken, someone's commitment to showing up day after day, often unseen and unacknowledged. As you lie there tonight, carrying the weight of what you're building, remember Mills at his telegraph key in the red centre of Australia. Remember his quiet dedication to keeping the connections flowing. Remember that the networks you're creating, the systems you're building, they too will depend on this kind of patient, persistent care. The messages will keep flowing because someone chooses to tend them. Challenges and triumphs. The line is completed, but the line was not yet complete. As 1871 drew toward its close, the northern section faced its greatest trial. The wet season had arrived with unprecedented fury, transforming the carefully surveyed route into a maze of swollen rivers and impassable swamps. Charles Todd, monitoring progress from his Adelaide office, felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle deeper on his shoulders. 2 years of construction, thousands of pounds spent, careers and reputations hanging in the balance. The southern and central sections had been completed on schedule, but without the northern link, the entire enterprise would remain incomplete. The crews working south from Darwin found themselves racing against more than weather. Equipment rusted in the relentless humidity. Insulators cracked under the thermal stress. Wire sagged and snapped as wooden poles warped and split in the tropical heat. But there was something else at work now, something that had grown quietly through months of shared hardship. The men no longer worked merely for wages or contracts. They worked for each other, for the vision they had all helped to shape. Aboriginal guides like Warrigal Joe became more than navigators. They became the keepers of ancient knowledge about where water could be found when the mapped waterholes ran dry. In a land where 3 days without water meant death, their wisdom meant the difference between success and catastrophe. The waterholes themselves became sacred places along the line, not just sources of life, but gathering points where crews from different sections would meet and share news. Here, around fires built beside these precious pools, men would speak quietly of home, of the letters that would soon travel this wire they were stringing across the continent. Thomas Henderson, the blacksmith whose forge had become the heart of so many camps, found himself working 18-hour days in the final push, repairing broken equipment, fashioning new parts from salvaged metal, his hammer ringing out like a heartbeat across the wilderness. "We're close now," he would tell the exhausted crews. "I can feel it in the work. Everything we've learned, everything we've built, it's all coming together." And it was. By October of 1872, the gaps were closing. Telegraph operators at stations hundreds of miles apart began to hear each other's signals. Faint at first, then stronger, the network was awakening. The final connection came on August the 22nd, 1872, not with fanfare or ceremony, but with the quiet click of a telegraph key in a small tent beside the Roper River. The operator tapped out a simple message, "Line complete." Those two words travelled south at the speed of light, racing across the continent that had taken Stuart months to cross on foot. In Adelaide, Charles Todd received the message and felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 12 years of planning and building: relief. But the true celebration came later, when the first international message arrived from London. After centuries of isolation, after months of waiting for ships to bring news from the wider world, Australia was finally connected. The message was simple: greetings to the people of Australia. But its meaning was profound. Distance had been conquered not through speed or force, but through patience, persistence, and the careful tending of connections. In telegraph stations across the continent, operators like William Mills found themselves handling a new kind of traffic: personal messages, business communications, news that would arrive in hours rather than months. The rhythm of Australian life was changing, and they were the guardians of that transformation. As you lie there tonight, feeling the weight of what you're building, remember that final moment when the circuit was complete. Remember that great endeavors are finished not with dramatic gestures, but with quiet persistence in the face of mounting obstacles. Think of those crews in the northern section working through the wet season, not because the conditions were favorable, but because the work needed to be done. Think of the Aboriginal guides sharing their knowledge of hidden waterholes, understanding that some wisdom can only be earned through generations of patient observation. The overland telegraph line would serve Australia for decades, carrying millions of messages across the continent. But its greatest achievement was not technological. It was human. It proved that impossible distances could be bridged through collective effort. That isolation could be overcome through the patient building of connections. The waterholes that sustained the builders remained scattered across the outback, quiet pools reflecting the endless sky. Some are still marked on maps, others known only to the land itself, but each one represents a moment when human ambition was sustained by the ancient wisdom of the continent, when the dream of connection was kept alive by the simple presence of water in a thirsty land. The line was complete, and Australia was no longer alone. A legacy of connection stars over the outback. Tonight, as you rest, that line still carries messages across the continent, though the poles have been replaced by towers, the copper by fiber, the Morse code by streams of light. But the dream remains unchanged, the ancient human need to reach across distance and say, "You are not alone." The telegraph operators who once sat in isolation at their keys, listening to the rhythm of distant voices, they understood something profound about the weight you carry. In the depths of the outback night, when the generator hummed and the wire sang with distant conversations, they were guardians of connection itself, keeping the channels open between scattered souls, maintaining the invisible threads that bind us together across the vast spaces of ambition and uncertainty. Charles Todd lived to see his line become the backbone of a connected continent, watched as his impossible dream transformed into the foundation for everything that followed. He understood that the greatest achievements are not monuments to individual brilliance, but testaments to the patient accumulation of human care, the daily choice to tend the connections that sustain us all. The stars that guided Stuart's expedition still wheel overhead, the same constellations that watched the camel trains cross the endless red earth, that witnessed the first spark of connection leap across the continent. In the outback, under that vast canopy of light, distance becomes not an obstacle, but a canvas. Space not for separation, but for the patient art of reaching toward one another. What you're building, the weight you carry. It joins this ancient conversation between ambition and endurance, between the dream of connection and the daily work of maintaining it. Like those telegraph operators in their remote stations, you are tending something larger than yourself, keeping channels open, maintaining the flow of human possibility across the challenging terrain of leadership and responsibility. The outback remembers everything: the footsteps of explorers, the rhythm of construction, the patient pulse of messages traveling through wire and space. It holds the memory of every moment when human determination met the vast indifference of distance, and chose to build bridges anyway, chose to say that isolation need not be permanent, that connection is always possible for those willing to do the patient work of reaching across the spaces between us. And tonight, as the stars turn overhead in their ancient patterns, that same patient work continues, in what you're building, in the connections you're maintaining, in the simple, enduring choice to keep the channels open, to tend the invisible networks that sustain us all, to rest now, knowing that the work of connection, like the stars themselves, continues, even as you sleep.